the starting point for this is what is the aim of Brechtian acting? And that aim seems to be the simple sentence to represent the individual in society realistically. But the word realistically, as I'm sure we all know, is absolutely loaded, and it's worth interrogating briefly. The conventional definition of realism is to represent people and situations as they appear in everyday life. And this is fundamentally an aesthetic aim. However, in the Brechtian definition, realistic might mean to represent the ways in which society produces the appearances of everyday people and situations, and this is fundamentally a philosophical aim. So there's already an important difference in these two definitions of what realism might be. One based very solidly in an aesthetic to reproduce what we see in everyday life, and you can train actors to do things like that. The other is a more philosophical starting point, and so the idea of representing philosophical positions through an aesthetic is already made problematic by this distinction. But these two interpretations of realistically also have their own implications. So if we think of the more conventional idea of realism, it has a philosophical corollary of what we see on stage is presenting the world as it is. This is real, this is the world. The Brechtian version has an aesthetic corollary, as I've just been suggesting, that acting's no longer concerned purely with the reproduction of everyday behaviour. So already the foundation of Stanislavski and his tradition of of what we were supposed to achieve is being undermined by a philosophical idea that comes before it. So to understand the idea of the method, it's worth interrogating the bases of Brechtian acting. And their heart is the dialectical method of approaching reality, rendered graphically here in the usual kind of abstract terms, that at some point in space and time there is a thesis. I'm going to put clothes on these abstracts bones pretty soon. Somewhere in space and time there is a thesis, and it finds at the same time an antithesis. The relationship between the two is one of contradiction. When that contradiction becomes too great, a synthesis of the two sides emerges, but as time progresses, that synthesis becomes a new thesis, a new antithesis comes about. Again, the relationship is one of contradiction. When the contradiction becomes too great, a new synthesis, and this occurs in perpetuity. So the dialectical mechanic is there. The question is, why are dialectics so interesting and engaging to someone like Brecht? The dialectic presents a dynamic model of why things change. So clearly, in drama, representing a world in flux, understanding or at least underpinning notions of change, this provides a very useful structure. It's also applicable to both the individual and to society. So if I look at society first, if you take the example of the French Revolution, 1789, the thesis you could consider to be ruled by the aristocracy, the antithesis, the emergence of a middle class that is wanting more of a slice of the cake, saying this inherited rule can't go on. The synthesis, the French Revolution, but the revolution doesn't stop history. Napoleon comes along as an emperor, he's later deposed. History continues through this tension between thesis and antithesis. Effectively, this is saying that the thing in itself never really exists. It's always defined by ideas of context. If you think about Brecht then integrates the dialectical ideas into ideas of his stagecraft. At the top of his theoretical idea about how the dialectic informs theatre is the idea of the fable. And this is a dialectical interpretation of both a play's plot and the action in any particular scene. In terms of plot, he interprets Hamlet as Hamlet the figure caught between two epochs, between two value systems, a medieval feudal one represented by his murdered father, and an epoch of individualism represented by Claudius and himself, applying reason to various problems. And so the structure is no longer focused on Hamlet as an individual who's either sort of dithering or ethically refusing to act on the ghost of his father's instruction. He's someone who's caught between two value systems that exist way beyond him, that this is about a dialogue between the individual and his society. Brecht himself saw his production in 1956, well, he died during rehearsals, it was complete in 1957, but his Life of Galileo he saw as the overall fable of this production as that of Humpty Dumpty, that Humpty Dumpty, Galileo has a great fall, and after that he cannot be put back together again. There is no redemptive interpretation at the end of that production. The fable also is a way of approaching the way that scenes work, that it looks at breaking down each change of event and understanding how these events affect the characters. So it's not as if characters have an autonomy in these scenes, it's how they respond to changes in events that go beyond them. So that's the fable. The fable is a series of interpretations. These are then made concrete in what's Brecht understood as arrangements or arrangements. These are a series of tableaus that unfold the contradictions of the fable on stage before the audience's eyes as a series of contradictory events. The examples I give here are from Brecht's The Irresistible Rise of Arturo Ui, the allegorical play about the rise of Hitler told through an Italian-American gangster. If you look at this image from early in the 1959 production, Ui, the gangster, is on the side. There's a conscious frame there from which he's being excluded by a bunch of fellows who are chatting about their business affairs. A couple of scenes later, the frame is still there, but Ui is placed concretely within it. Those same people who we saw in that first scene are standing behind him in a different kind of body language. Ui is now clearly integrated into the centre of this, having been marginal before. That the arrangements of these scenes unfold the story in their contradictory complexity. Gestus, a term that came up just before, in terms of the actor connecting the actor's body to ideas of their place in society. Here we have a series of 4 images of the same actor playing a series of different roles, playing a servant girl there, a young bourgeois there, a woman of a village there, and an old woman there. As you notice, 3 of these are more working class roles, but there's no inevitability that playing someone from this class leads to a certain mode of performance. And this is an example of one of the other actors of the Berlin ensemble playing a series of different characters and trying to find a physicality that connects that person to society. A further term that Brecht uses quite often is Haltung, which is German for attitude, which we might consider a mental concerning the mind, and physical bearing. And this term combines the two into the way that actors change their body shapes and the way that they represent themselves in different times and in different scenes. So Haltung is always a dynamic idea. One has an attitude towards something, and as that something changes, so will the attitude. The idea here is that this is again undermining an individual's autonomy, so that a character becomes almost a sum of their different Haltungs, rather than having an essential character. This is an opportunity to express a character's contradictions, that their body shape might be quite different towards their parents, their friends, employer, their employees, to reveal the social contradictions that run through the different encounters that these characters have in dramatic action. In this one from the Caucasian chalk circle, this is when a peasant couple pick up the abandoned baby on their doorstep. Here again, the Haltung, the attitude, the physicalized attitude towards that child, that the contradiction there is spelt out very clearly, visually, without a word having been spoken. In this crowd scene from the Trial of Joan of Arc, each of the different characters in the crowd are doing different things. The nun is praying in some sort of despair, whereas the monk is busy hiding the child's eyes from the heretic. Other people are involved in different attitudes towards the very same object of Joan of Arc being taken for trial. So in Rehearsal, Brecht asks a very different set of questions from those that one might encounter in different modes of representation. The actor is asked to develop a sensitivity to dialectical analysis, but without getting involved in lengthy philosophical disquisitions. That in Rehearsal, there's no sense of, oh, here's the antithesis, here's the thesis, how are we going to synthesize this? Far more, actors were involved in finding breaks and turning points in their figures. That they were far more thinking about discontinuity, those sorts of practical ways of thinking of how to represent their characters, as opposed to getting involved in philosophical issues. Although the word contradiction is used very often in Rehearsal, trying to find these contradictions as an easier way of locating an actor, as opposed to using difficult philosophical terms. So the actor in Rehearsal becomes a kind of social interpreter, trying to look beyond what a character is doing or what a character wants, and to understand the tension between that and the pressure of events that is going on around them. Actors are also required to negotiate the contradictions of their characters and to negotiate the contradictions of a scene. And to make the results of the rehearsal striking, which takes us back to the idea of Verfremdung that Steve was talking about before, that it's worth noting that Brecht's is a theatre of showing. Anything that is significant needs to be displayed, it needs to be set out. It's also a theatre of making the familiar strange, of Verfremdung, of trying to present something that the audience thinks they know in terms that put them in inverted commas or draw our attention to them to engage us in such a way. And so both of these ideas suggest a heightened use of realistic signs on stage rather than the surface realism that you associate with other types of realism.